Well, welcome to the last session of our Spring Sync event, Belonging, Creating an Environment Where Students Want to Be. I will serve as your moderator for today. I am Taria Thornton. I am the Pre-Law and Diversity Initiatives Director here at Access Lex Institute, a part of the Center for Education and Financial Capability. Along with being your moderator for today's session, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's presenters. Before we dive into today's content, I want to encourage you, just like you've been encouraged in all of the other sessions, please put your questions into that Q&A panel, even if you want to give virtual snaps to our presenters, because they will undoubtedly have some gems that you will want to make sure you comment on today, or any kind of reactions that you may have as well. So moving along, because we have a lot of ground to cover, they're going to help us unpack and lean into today's conversation. I want to make sure that you know who are our experts for today's presentation. We first have Dean Belinda Dantley, the Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Louis University School of Law. We also have joining us Dean Lisa Taylor, Assistant Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Affinity Relations at American University, Washington College of Law. So I will not prolong this anymore. We want to get started since we have a little bit of a shorter time for today's presentation, but I will turn it over to Dean Dantley. Thank you both so much for joining us and helping us unpack this topic.
Thank you so much, Taria. So we are going to start off with an activity. If you would get your cell phones out, we would like for you to think about someone to text who, one, would not be a little startled with you texting them in the middle of the day, who you are fairly certain would text you back almost immediately, and think about someone who you would want to text the declaration, "I belong here." Take a few moments to do that, and we will actually come back to this activity in a few minutes, but get those texts out. You are on mute, Dean Taylor.
I knew that was going to happen. So our objectives for today are pretty straightforward. We want to explain what is meant by belonging. Then we will discuss why belonging is an important concept for educators to know about and to understand. And then we will examine how belonging can be measured and evaluated. And finally, identify strategies to create a sense of belonging in law schools. So what is belonging, right? You may find many definitions of belonging, but as a concept, belonging is not nebulous. It is an output-oriented metric that measures the success of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. In fact, you may see a lot of diversity positions now being defined as belonging. So let's start with a definition that is appropriate in the educational setting. Belonging is the perception of connectedness to the institution, the experience of mattering, and the feeling of being cared about and important to the campus community. So now that we have,
It's okay. So another way to think about belonging is to also look at the other words that we are using that tend to go along with it, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are going to focus on or think of a way to think about them a little differently, right? So think about it in this way, that you're having a party at your house. You are planning it, you figure out what the theme is and everything else, and now it's time for the invites. Think about diversity as inviting all of your coworkers. You send out that email, you say, come celebrate with us. It's gonna happen on this date, please come, right? So that's diversity. You're getting all of the people there. Then you have inclusion. Think about inclusion as, well, who feels welcome enough to come to the party? As well as while they're there, they're eating some food, they're having conversations, they're even dancing. They feel like someone wants them to be there. Let's take that a step further and think about belonging. Think about belonging as your coworker continually being invited over to your house, where they feel comfortable to do all the things that we talked about at the top, eating, partying, dancing. And they also now, when they come over, they know where the cups are. They go in the refrigerator and pour themselves a drink. They're even helping controlling the music. They feel like they are supposed to be there, not only just invited for a short period of time.
Great. So now that we have a definition and a little better understanding of belonging, let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. I view belonging through distinct but interrelated lenses. The first is student perceptions, or whether a student perceives a connection with their institution. And to be clear, this is more than a simple warmth or liking of the institution. The difference between liking the institution and belonging is the difference between weather and climate change, right? So to have a sense of belonging, students need a few things. They need to be supported and encouraged by faculty, administrators, and their peers. They need to feel that those groups have a real genuine concern for them and a concern for their success and their well-being. Students also need to feel connected to others who are part of that institution, and to have the ability to develop interpersonal relationships and that are real and that are ongoing. They also need to feel valued within the institution. They need to feel an important part of the academic experience, and they need to be recognized for their unique contributions to the enterprise. Students also need to be respected. They need to be respected for their individuality and their autonomy. They need to feel proud of the institution and proud to be a part of the institution, and feel like the institutional values and purpose align with theirs. And finally, they need to experience psychological and physical safety. So therefore, in a nutshell, student perceptions involve being supported, connected, valued, recognized, respected, proud, and safe. The second lens is social identity. Perceptions are filtered through your social identities. A student's perception of whether they fit in at an institution is influenced by their race, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, gender expression, ability, and other social identities. It is also influenced by the resulting philosophy of who they are based on this social identity. Feeling seen, feeling connected, supported, and valued must extend to the sense of acceptance for who you are and how you are included, and whether you can be your authentic selves within an institution. Where discrimination, stereotyping, and bias are managed appropriately, and students don't have to code switch in order to survive. So put another way, the absence of a sense of belonging can be described as a sense of alienation, rejection, social isolation, loneliness, and marginality. So we understand why, for students who are from communities that are already historically excluded and minoritized in legal education, why belonging is such a valuable metric to serve these populations. And the final lens is structural. These involve institutional characteristics and culture. Institutional characteristics include the size, student-faculty ratio, the mission of the school, the location, and other structural things that can influence a student's sense of belonging, that the student can connect with and can find community. The other part of this is institutional culture. These are where you have things where like faculty and staff are responsive and available to students. There's institutional equity in policies and practices. It is in how the administration approaches approaches decision-making, right? Is the decision-making process inclusive and equity-minded? It is how the administration deals with incidents of bias and stereotyping and discrimination. And it's whether the institution signals to a student that their social and cultural practices are welcomed and appropriate, and whether their tacit knowledge is valued within the institution. These are all institutional cultural factors that influence a student's sense of belonging. So the key factors of belonging that I personally connect with is that it's student-centered, right? It is about how a student perceives their experience. And a school cannot pat itself on the back for performative efforts at diversity, inclusion, and equity if the data shows that students are not connected to the institution. It is also measurable, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about how to measure or evaluate belonging. But it's also holistic. It measures the entire student experience. Everyone is on the hook for belonging. Faculty, staff, students, particularly in law school where socialization is an essential part of professional identity formation. So let's get back to our activity from the book College Students' Sense of Belonging. This book was written by Tyrell Strayhorn. So let me ask you, have you received any responses from your text? If so, let's reflect. Did you not receive a response? Or was there disagreement or dismissiveness? Or did you get like a quizzical emoji back? Then take a moment to sense your feelings. Channel them towards your mind. What are you thinking? What meaning do you take from this exchange? What do you want to do because of this exchange? Connect with those emotions before we move on. On the other hand, did you receive affirming and warm responses? Did you get an, of course you do, of course you belong here, or a heart emoji from someone? If so, pause and connect with that moment. That's your mind, your body and soul converging on the sentiment that you are important, that you matter to someone, and that you belong.
Having feelings of belonging are so essential. They are in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They are right in the center, right next to love. It is a prime motivator for human behavior. Humans are wired with a need to belong. It's intrinsic motivation that we feel we are socially accepted and connected to others. People are wired to feel connected to others and have a sense of belonging. It's important for us to note that in this pyramid of needs, that in order for someone to feel like they belong in a space, there are two other levels of basic needs that have to be met beforehand. So as an institution, as people who are working with others, we need to make sure that we are also being mindful of the fact that people need to have proper practices when it comes to well-being around food and sleep and security and health. And that is something that we can pay attention to as institutions when we're looking at where to allocate resources. But it's also important for us to know that when we are expecting, especially our students, to reach the full potential in their life, to be successful in law school, to really show up as their best selves, they cannot do that without feelings of belonging. They need to have feelings of belonging before they are able to have higher self-esteem and recognition of their strengths, and then eventually, hopefully, self-actualization within their law school experiences. Additionally, And belonging is directly tied to the success of that student, right? That reaching that self-actualization, that reaching that full potential when it comes to success in law school. It's important for them to have that engagement and that sense of belonging from the institutional standpoint, because that is going to help with student retention. It's going to help with student retention. It's going to help with even as far out as bar passage rate when we're looking at success. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the Lessee Surveys. These surveys compile data, and one of the areas that they compile data on when it comes to the law school experience is diversity and inclusiveness. In one of the surveys, there were results that showed that white students are more likely to have a sense of belonging than their classmates of color. They also note and target first-generation students. And in one of their surveys, only 23% of first-generation students strongly agree that they feel a part of a community at their law school. It's important to understand, see, and be aware of data along these lines when we're looking at where to allocate resources, how to implement certain programming, and knowing which students are affected the most when it comes to a sense of belonging. When you read statistics like only 23% of a population of students feel like they belong, that is where you need to redirect some funds. You need to come up with specific programming that targets their needs so that as an institution, you can combat that feeling of isolation or not feeling included. The data shows that experiences of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination were more pronounced for students of color and intersectionally women. All forms of perceived experiences and biases of stereotypes, concerns are significantly and adversely associated with a sense of belonging. We need to, as institutions, figure out when these experiences of bias and stereotypes or a feeling of isolation are happening. A sense of belonging, like we said, is directly linked to a student's success, their retention, the matriculation in law school, as well as bar passage rates. When we are looking at what makes a law student successful, a discussion of belonging has to be a part of that strategic planning. You're on mute.
Got it. So we want to take some time to talk about how belonging can be identified, measured, and evaluated. So we understand there are two communities here, a pre-law community and a law school community. So we broke it down into two parts. So for the pre-law community, as we said before, belonging is not nebulous and it's not just a buzzword, right? So we thought that it is important to help prospective students and law students gauge whether students like them are likely to feel a sense of belonging and to connect and engage, and as Belinda just indicated, to succeed at law school. As someone who has done both admissions and diversity work at law schools, I've seen where students frequently ask about diversity, and they sometimes ask about inclusion, but rarely do they ask about equity. I strongly believe that they sometimes miss an opportunity to evaluate law schools through one or all the lenses that I spoke about earlier. We can look at belonging as the intersection of, at the intersection of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I like to throw justice in there as well. So for diversity, students will tend to ask, who is in the room? Are there members of this community who look like me? Students want to know that they can form a community and that the school values them and not tokenizes them, right? For inclusion, students will ask, does everyone feel safe here? Does everyone have an opportunity to be heard? Students want to know that they can find culturally appropriate support and that people like them can achieve academically and socially and professionally. They want to know whether students like them are achieving leadership positions, receiving academic awards, passing the bar, and finding fulfillment in their chosen careers. For equity and justice, students should ask follow-up questions designed to gauge how others from their communities are respected and valued in the policies and practices of the institution. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you find out how courageous an institution is in breaking down barriers to their success. So asking not just who is in the room, equity questions ask, who is trying to get in this room but can't? And whose presence is under threat of erasure? Is this school in a large urban area that is 2/3 people of color, yet students of color only make up 10% of its population? What is the graduation rate and bar passage rate for students that look like me? Beyond asking whether everyone feels safe and heard, justice asks whose safety is being sacrificed for the comfort of the majority here? Or who is not just heard, but who is heeded in the decision-making processes? So when making decisions about law schools, a pre-law student should ask questions about diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. But belonging at the center of all three is the indicator of their likelihood of success at that institution.
Lisa, I'd like to go off script for a second because there is a question in the chat that I feel like is directly related about what you're currently talking about. So it says that eliminating the need for code switching is important, particularly in situations which code switching is necessary as a survival mechanism. Often, though, it's a method of communicating in a way that your audience understands. How do you distinguish between harmful code switching, i.e. survival, and simply tailoring expressions to the audience to facilitate communication? And I would like to start off by saying your description of equity and justice and asking the question of whose safety, and that I believe that psychological safety as well is being sacrificed for the comfort of the majority. And I think that also goes to what you talked about earlier when it comes to identity and how someone is able to express how they're able to show up in spaces and whether or not they are changing things about their identity or downplaying things about their identity in order to make other people feel comfortable in that space.
Yes, I agree. I think if we're looking at belonging, I'm not sure if we can actually make those distinctions about whether someone is doing it for survival or whether they're doing it because of the environment they're in, right? I think both of them are being done for survival. I think it is incumbent upon the institution to recognize that students have to code switch. And sometimes one of the things I find about law school is there are a lot of mythologies about law and a lot of thought about you have to do it this way in order to achieve. And we need to rethink these things. And that's where I talk about an institution being courageous in breaking down barriers for students. Because we've done things the same way for 100 years, doesn't mean that it's the right way and the inclusive way to do things. And having the courage to look at structures that cause students to break down barriers is important. I'll give you an example of it. We had a conversation at our law school about using they as a singular pronoun. And our legal writing instructors were a little hesitant because they thought if you use they as a singular pronoun and you go and you're an intern for a judge, they will think that you can't write. And we had a conversation about, no, the world is changing. One, I think judges probably know what they as a singular pronoun me, then would probably accept it. And what we can do is teach students to do both. And then when they go out into the workforce, have conversations with judges about how to use it. So in that way, it's not telling the student you can't do this, but actually breaking down the structures, right? So that this profession becomes more inclusive of the different cultures that we want to be a part of the profession. So we'll move on to how it is measured by law schools. So I think measuring belonging at your institution can serve as a critical and ongoing guidepost for your DEI efforts. So tools that can be used in these efforts include doing climate surveys, right? Often universities administer surveys, climate surveys every 2 to 3 years as part of their strategic planning process. I know at American University, we typically complete climate surveys every 3 years for students, staff, and faculty. And the collected data are used for AU's Plan for Inclusive Excellence. I spent the better part of this semester working with AU's IRB to adapt their survey for our law students. Another significant source of information, as Belinda mentioned before, is the Law School Survey of Student Engagement. This is a great tool, of course, for measuring engagement. And as Belinda explained, belonging drives engagement and engagement drives success. Additionally, the Lessee office offers topical surveys as an add-on to your engagement survey. So this year we added their diversity and inclusion topical survey, which measures belonging. It asks questions about their perception of belonging at law school. The other thing we can use are focus groups. The first year that I was at WCL, I did a listening tour, and I did focus groups I tried to do with all our affinity organizations, right? I wanted to get a feel for the experience of our students from different communities at WCL. And the information, the data I collected from that was instrumental in me designing programs for the following year. It was also helpful for me when I talk to the community about where our needs are. I also think collecting anecdotes is important too, as well as storytelling, right? These put a human touch to the data that we're collecting. Anecdotes I get from my interaction with the student-facing offices, right? So for instance, we have an Office of Academic Excellence here, and when I talk to them, they tell me about what students are saying about their experience and how that experience is driving their academic success. So I collect that information. Sometimes I go out proactively and I talk to students and I ask them to tell their stories about their experience. And where it's safe for them, I let them speak directly to staff and faculty. And so staff and faculty can understand that not everyone is having the same experience here, and basically take an intersectional look at what different experiences are at the law school. So those are ways that you as an administrator can collect data about belonging. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Belinda to talk about how we can use this data to build strategies and interventions that address belonging. You're muted, Belinda.
Thank you. Morgan, thank you. I am actually taking a page from that book, and I am using anecdotes and information that I received from students and working with them, as well as anecdotes that we've received from surveys that we have researched when it comes to looking at what allows students or what enables students to feel like they are belonging at the institution. And 4 main themes kept coming up, right? So they need to have supportive peer relationships. They need to have meaningful interaction between staff and students. They need to build engagement and belonging, also developing knowledge and confidence, and identify success in the legal academy and experience that is relevant to the interest in their future goals. So one effective intervention is to start this at pre-entry. Start doing these initiatives before the student gets to the institution. This looks like having, I'm going to put it into 3 different buckets, right? Like social interactions, inclusive pedagogy, and what professional staff and administrators can do. When students are able to develop their peer networks and friendships, they are able to get connections also, or confidence to have connections with academic members of the staff so that they can get information, get a realistic understanding of what expectations are, improve their academic skills, develop their confidence, and then also get an understanding of what's expected of them beyond the law school experience. Studies have shown that many students feel underprepared when they come to law school and find that their academic experience is not as they expect it to do. And this at times can lead to early withdrawal. Programs geared to shed light on the nuances of law school increase feelings of understanding and ultimately a sense of belonging. This can be accomplished very well in small group settings. A part of the data that came out was that information is received and retained more when programming is done in small group settings as opposed to the large lecture hall type programming. And as mentioned, like supportive peer relations, not only just with students who are in the same level of law school as them, but also getting some sort of peer mentoring from upper division students. That is where they are getting information on learning how to learn, right, at a higher level. What expectations are expected in the classroom in a more explicit way. This has been seen done successfully with the use of like student ambassadors as early as when students are coming to tour the law school, even before they're making decisions on where they're going. Really, bottom line is that students feel that they retain information the most when it comes from other students. I am Deb in this, the parents just don't understand phenomenon. They want to hear from current students, right? And a great way to do that really is to understand that social interactions are so important to a student's ability to feel like they belong in a space and for them to also be successful. Sorry. So as I mentioned, this really should be happening at the pre-entry, or should start happening at the pre-entry or pre-orientation phase. And I have seen this done successfully, and I'm gonna probably date myself a little bit, by creating Facebook groups for them to join and be a part of before they enter. In those spaces, they're able to communicate with each other on small things like, where are you getting your textbook? Larger things on where are people renting? Where are you getting apartments? What part of town? Who's going to be in town before the semester starts, so that they're able to start building their networks and building their social groups to help them even before they get to the institution. Affinity organizations are also really important to increase the success of social interactions effect on the academic success of students. Another large area that will increase the sense of belonging at the institution is with the use of inclusive pedagogy. So looking at whether, okay, I have to pause for a bit because my notes are wrong. and it's throwing me off. I'm sorry, guys. Okay. Inclusive pedagogy, right? So having discussions of race and ethnicity and other identity related topics in the classroom, along with the rules of a case and what law you're supposed to be pulling out. Developing skills to work effectively with people from various backgrounds. So many of our students come to us from homogenous educational settings and have not had the opportunity to interact with people from various backgrounds. And it is crucially important for them to gain these skills if they haven't already when they come to us, because that's what's expected of them in the legal profession. Give opportunities in the classroom setting for them to reflect on their own backgrounds, how they show up to spaces, how they are going to present themselves to future clients, how they are going to be able to build relationships with future clients across differences. And then also in the classroom, connecting real world issues. It is a disservice to students when we ignore things that are happening outside of the classroom, when we ignore the fact that things that happen outside of the classroom affect the success of students and whether or not they are feeling like they as whole persons who are experiencing things in the world are being acknowledged when they show up to your buildings and your institutions, and whether or not your law school or your classrooms are the places in which they can bring those real world issues and grapple with them and understand them and get better at dealing with them and coming up with solutions, right? So these are areas of social interactions, inclusive pedagogy, where these specific two things are areas in which really affect a student's understanding or a student's perception of belonging at an institution. I'd also like to make a side note about assessments. When you are practicing inclusive pedagogy at your institution, it's important for a very basic thing to happen at the very beginning, and that is making the expectations of assessments very explicit and very clear, that it is not presented in a way that students are guessing on how to do well, but it is laid out very clearly on what is expected, whether that is with the use of rubrics or full discussions before they are expected to then participate in that assessment. So much of law school for students is just figuring out how to do things, and not necessarily how to understand certain cases, but how to then be able to relay that information when it comes to assessment time. Lastly, and really the simplest and most impactful thing that I hear from students that I have seen in the survey is their interaction with professional staff and administrators. The three main themes that come up when it comes to students feeling like they belong are really simple things like knowing the students, including their names and viewing them as individuals, appearing interested in the students and their progress and not just their problems. And also professional staff and administrators being available and responding to students' contact and appropriate in timely manner. These are instances where really the little things count. They are very easy and simple things to show that we care about their well-being and their success. And it strengthens a student's relationship with the institution and their sense of belonging. Ultimately, we need to, as institutions, think about how students are feeling in the classroom, in the hallways, and in social spaces. Do they feel comfortable enough to ask professors for help? Are they brainstorming ideas with their peers? Are they asking for resources for additional help? Or are they showing up to student organization events? Are your students comfortable enough to open the fridge and pour their own drinks? Do they genuinely feel like they belong at your institutions?
Thank you so much for all of the valuable information that you have offered. We do want to open it up for questions, so feel free to put that into that Q&A panel. I do want to start off with some of the reactions to the activity that you all posed. I love that Robin said the response to the text message was, let's have dinner. So perhaps it was a little bit of a celebratory moment where, yes, you feel that you belong. So let's celebrate that. Yolanda also said that she's stealing this activity. It was definitely something that we all enjoyed. So I wanted
to say, I'm sorry. I wanted to say, I hope I posted the book that activity came from in the chat. So I hope everyone saw that.
Yes, thank you for doing that as well. So everyone, if you want to steal it, you now know where to steal it from. So let's start off with this first question, because we even had a session talking about kind of distance learning. We know from the pandemic, virtual learning, hybrid programs, even all online programs are not going away. And we know that the lack of belonging makes someone feel like they're isolated. And that's something we heard a lot with distance learning. So what does it look like to create a belonging in a virtual sense of what have we learned from the past, and how can we make sure that we can include belonging in a virtual setting as well?
Yeah, I know for me, I spoke to faculty a lot about not thinking about the virtual environment as if you're just moving the class online, right? And thinking through ways to connect with students in the virtual environment, to encourage students to still participate in class, as well as to interact with each other. So having like breakout groups that you may not do while you're in person, right? And just opportunities to come together. And also outside of the classroom, thinking about how you can continue to make sure that students are connected with their communities. I mean, at our law school, our affinity groups are really strong, which is why my title is Affinity Relations. So one of the things I wanted to make sure is that our affinity groups were still thriving, because I knew that is a significant source of support for students at our school. So making sure we were still having those opportunities, and where I could, providing opportunities from the administration for affinity groups, particularly the smaller affinity groups, right? The ones that have smaller memberships, making sure I was checking in with them and making sure we were providing opportunities for them to still thrive and meet.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to add, because I talked about inclusive pedagogy, and I think having distance learning, because it was so different than what we have been doing for hundreds of years, there was so much aversion to it. But there's so much more we can do, I believe anyway, outside of the classroom when it comes to presenting the information in ways that people can digest and understand, because we have neurodiversity, right? Like, we are able to present the information not just in a lecture format or them reading the textbook, but also assigning things like podcasts and videos and thinking about how your PowerPoints look on the screen as ways to make sure that you are reaching people, you are reaching students in a way that they are going to receive the information best. That is acknowledging that not all students are going to receive this information the same way. So when I present it to you in varied medias, I am acknowledging that people learn differently, and I want you to feel like you belong and that you need, and that you can grasp this information and get this information in the way that you receive it best. And I also want to say there's a comment in here that talks about how we describe belonging when it comes to opening the fridge. And I have to give credit to our colleague, Ralph Tavares, because I did not come up with that. I just loved it so much. I used it in this presentation.
Thank you for that acknowledgement. Always good to acknowledge where ideas actually come from. But we are actually out of time. I don't think that we can ever have enough time to unpack this important topic of belonging. So join me in virtually thanking both of our presenters, Dean Taylor and Dean Dantley, for allowing us to lean a little bit more into this topic of belonging and really understanding how important, since these students are planted on our institutions at our campuses, to help them bloom where they are planted. So we are not done yet. We want to give you a proper send-off. So we want to make sure that you join us for our wrap-up session. You can join us by going back to the hub. There are a couple of things that we want to do to make sure that we wrap everything up for you all as we're closing out today's Spring Sync session. And we still have to announce our winner of the social media contest. So we want to make sure that we give you all of that information, and don't forget to do your surveys. We want to make sure that we're as responsive to your needs, your requests as we can be moving forward. So again, thank you so much, Dean Taylor and Dean Dantley, and we'll see you shortly in the wrap-up session.